Hello, Janeites, and welcome to Austen Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Jane Austen Society of North America. I'm your host, Brecken Wood, from the Georgia region of JASNA. Listeners, depending on where you are in the world, you may be enjoying the loveliest of sunny weather right now, but if you are in the northern hemisphere, like I am, you are likely still languishing in winter's cruel grasp. To help dispel some of that chilly gloom, I have invited Kim Wilson to talk with us today about nature and gardens in Austen's life and work. Kim Wilson is a writer and speaker, a JASNA Life member, and past regional coordinator for JASNA Wisconsin. She has presented at several previous AGMs, and she was a JASNA Traveling Lecturer for the 2023-2024 year. She is the author of At Home with Jane Austen, Tea with Jane Austen, and In the Garden with Jane Austen. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Hi, Brecken. Thanks for having me.
Okay, to start off, we're going to play an Austen version of Would You Rather. To go along with today's garden theme, I've picked an outdoorsy question for you. So would you rather stroll the Cobb at Lyme Regis with its beautiful line of cliffs and extensive sweeps of country, or ride on horseback around the fine spots and shady lanes around Mansfield Park?
Oh, that's a good one. I think I'm going to pick the Cobb at Lyme. I'm from Seattle originally, and so anything on the coast and the seaside really speaks to me, which I actually think it spoke to Austen too, judging by her comments. And in fact, when I look at the descriptions of the scenery in her books, she does not spend a lot of time on it. You know, her contemporary authors would just wax on and on about scenery and the beauty of it, and half the time they had never seen it, you know, the beauties of Switzerland or something. But the one place where she just gets, I think, lyrical is in her description of the scenery around Lyme, going on about the cliffs and the, you know, sweet retired bay, scattered forest trees and orchards of luxuriant growth. What does she say? It's wonderful and lovely. So anyway, I'm on board with that.
That's interesting. You're right. I think it is a little bit unusual for her because Austen is very much an author of the mind and of the interior. And so when she does start describing anything external, like how people look or how a scene looks, you kind of pay attention because you're like, oh, we don't usually get this many details.
I'm grateful for it. Often we're thinking, well, she never describes dress, or she doesn't describe, how people look always very well. And but when you read her contemporaries, and they will just come to a screeching halt and throw in 20 pages of, backstory or descriptions, like I said, of Swiss mountains, and she just makes her just fresh and modern, and as you said, of the mind. So when it's there, I think it's important. I think it means something to her.
I agree. Okay, so Kim, Jane Austen loved gardens and the outdoors. She talks about it in her letters, and nature is an important theme in her books. Even if she doesn't, spend pages and pages describing it, it comes up a lot. So what kind of gardens and nature would Austen have been most familiar with?
Well, pretty much everything, because of her position in society, which is one of the, minor gentry. She knew everything from, wretched little cottage gardens where she, as, one of the ladies of a village in Steventon or Chawton, she would be dispensing charity like Emma does to the villagers in Emma. All the way through her own family gardens, parsonage gardens, cottage gardens, small manor houses, up to grand estates, like her brother had at Gomersham and Chawton. Possibly she may have visited even like Chatsworth, estates that would have been the inspiration for, the great estate of Pemberley. So she would have been exposed to all of it. And we see that reflected in the novels. So.
Yeah. And do you have some pictures for us? Because I know in descriptions of your books, everyone's talking about how gorgeous all the images in your books are. And I think you have some for us today. Is that right?
I do. How do I? There we go.
Yes.
Okay.
Ooh, cottage
Can you
gardens.
see that?
I can see it. Yes. Rose, blush, and then a word I can't say.
Noisette. That's the variety that they grow. That's the kitchen door at Chawton Cottage.
That is so gorgeous. I don't know. Like, I feel like the overlap between people who like Jane Austen and people who like Lucy Maud Montgomery and Anne of Green Gables is like almost in the Venn diagram. It's almost a complete circle, right? And that is just so like Anne Shirley romantic. It makes my heart flutter seeing that doorway.
I think you're right. If you have like gardens and tea and, for a lot of people, kitties, I mean, it's all just we're all very tucked in there.
Definitely.
So, Austen, of course, the predominant influence. So looking first at cottage gardens, this is what I'm talking about. This is the actual sort of cottage. When we think of a cottage garden, it wasn't the romanticized thing that the people, the gentry, thought in Austen's day that if you lived in the country, it must be a cottage, but mostly these were laborers' cottages. And so not very fancy, but she definitely would have seen those in all the villages. And these appear, Maria Bertram talks about how disgraceful the cottage gardens are. That's Mr. Rushworth's estate. He's responsible for those. So that's a true cottage garden with its pathetic little coffin there. At the other end, so this is what Robert Ferrers is quacking on about a cottage, these cottage ornays. This is not very far from Chawton, actually. This is reminiscent of the cottage in Persuasion, Uppercross Cottage, where they elevate it and put a veranda on it and Gothic, pretty little French windows, Gothic windows. These are Ackerman prints showing the kind of cottage that you could build in the countryside. And so again, these are cottages for the gentry. And here's again at Houghton Lodge. And you might recognize this place from a lot of, I'll just go through and show you some of the pretty, it's too pretty to miss. They filmed this, a lot of things there, like David Copperfield and the Buccaneers and things like that. So you'll recognize that. That's the entrance to the shrubberies. We can talk about shrubberies later.
I love the word shrubbery. I really hope we're going to talk about shrubberies. Maybe it's just because of Monty Python.
Yes, I'd like a shrubbery, not too large, but yeah, yes. that actually is what set me off to write this book, because I was dying to know what a shrubbery was.
Really? That was it? That's awesome.
And the same with the tea book and the recipes. I was like, what on earth is a rout cake? And so I'm always answering my own questions. So that's the entrance to the shrubbery at Houghton Lodge. But I thought we mostly would like to look at the Austen family gardens. So we have the laborer's cottage garden, very low, the fanciful, kind of Marie Antoinette, Le Petit Trianon kind of level of the upper classes, and then in between, the Austens, their gardens were fit for gentry. We call this Chawton Cottage, this Jane Austen's house museum there, but they were in between. So you'd have parsonage gardens, for example, could count as a cottage garden. So this is where Jane Austen grew up in Steventon in Hampshire. Her niece drew these, and you can see simple house. They grew a lot of their own food. They're out in the countryside. The back, and this I love. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this led to a sundial, and they spoke about that Mr. Austen's study looked out on it.
Oh, really?
And that he could see there were strawberries lining the path. So it was described as an old-fashioned garden, mixing flowers with vegetables, with trees and orchards. And by the Victorian time, they had pretty much decided that was not fashionable, and they had hidden all of the vegetables and things behind walls. So, but Jane Austen would have known the mixed kind of garden.
That's gorgeous.
The side of that house now looks like this. And if you want to have some fun, you can go on Google Maps and go down the road and walk by. So I always picture if you go and you stand in the corner of this field and you see like people longingly looking into the field, that's us staring where the house. So by that tree. So yeah. So
I did want to mention, sorry, real quick, just because for people listening on the audio, this is a video episode as well. Kim has all of these gorgeous images. So if you want to see all the images we're talking about, they'll be in the, I think we can include them in the show notes, but definitely head over to YouTube because she's got all of these amazing images, both modern photography of these Austen sites, but also 18th century contemporary images that were drawn and painted. So
what I'm showing is the empty field where sadly the Austen parsonage was pulled down, and now it's inhabited by cows. Although it was so cute that I've read in the 1880s that people could still see flowers coming up through the grass that they knew had been there from the parsonage side.
From the Austen's time.
Kind of a ghost garden.
Yeah.
There's the site there again, and that little wooden structure surrounds the well that was at the back of the house. So no garden now, just farmland. But to me, what's significant is this feature here. This is the hill that goes up toward the church. And it reminds me exactly of Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, rolling down the hill. And she liked to do that. And I picture Jane Austen
All her
doing the same thing.
tomboyish pursuits.
Yeah, I think so. If you grow up with that many brothers, you're going to be, right? The reason I'm showing, I have here a picture of the church at the top of the hill, and that yew tree is significant to me because I started thinking we were talking about gardens and how they relate to the 250th anniversary of her birth. And I thought, what still exists? I mean, often the outline of the garden is known, but the plants are different. Or at Chawton Cottage, for example, we'll see they grow 18th century varieties, but they don't know the plan. Right? So not everything is there, but some trees were. And so that yew tree, which is thought to date to about the same time as the church, like 1200, was there definitely, probably about the same size when Austen was there. And just
That's
to show
incredible.
you, to give you an idea of the size, this is my daughter when we visited. And I mean, it's big enough. There's hollows that you can kind of play in. And I picture the Austen children playing under
Definitely.
that. So,
like the Austen boys, if not Austen herself, were climbing those branches because they're so low. You can just, I mean, who doesn't want to climb that tree? I want to climb that tree.
It's partially hollow. So, yeah. So to me, even though it's not strictly in the garden, it's a tree, and we can walk up to it and think Jane Austen touched this tree. So.
Amazing.
I know.
Well, anyway, you've got Chawton Cottage up on the screen right now, which,
yes,
and I know that Cassandra had trees, right? She had an orchard. And what was Jane's involvement in the garden?
Well, I get the impression that just like Cassandra, her sister, was more involved in the housekeeping, and they may have just let Jane alone to do her writing. I just wanted to share this aerial view that they gave me because you can see the yew tree at the left, and we can't prove another yew tree. We can't prove it's big enough, could be old enough, but yew trees are notoriously hard to date because you can't core them properly.
Really?
But I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that yew tree was there when Austen was there, right? It's very important to me.
I buy it.
Yeah, let's go with it. So I just have some pictures of the cottage, the garden, and again, I don't think Jane Austen herself was terribly involved. I know she mentions it. She mentions what they're growing. Jane and Cassandra's brother, Edward, this belonged to his estate at Chawton House, which we can look at. And he had this fixed up for them to turn it into more of a gentlewoman's cottage. His steward lived there. But there's records in in the Chawton House estate records talking about him having the garden trenched and dug over. So I assume they're putting in mulch and compost and that sort of thing. He put in an orchard. He put in a nice vegetable garden. He put in a gravel walk through a shrubbery. And I can show you, I'll just go through here. So here's the yews from the other side. So again, you run up and touch the yews and think, did Jane Austen touch those? They have an oak that they grow there too, that the whole village said that she planted. Jane Austen herself planted an oak, but no one can prove it. Well, then it got diseased and was cut down in 1986. And they saved a seedling, and that's what's growing there now. So again, it's, what could be. Yeah. So they grow... the gardener, Celia Simpson, is just a marvel. She grows 18th century varieties where she can. So almost everything you see there, these roses, for example, are period. Those are some of my friends who were just there. I got them to take new pictures for me. So this is the front. Just makes me happy to look at the pictures.
Yeah, no, it's
so this is a recreation of sort of a shrubbery that Jane's brother Edward put in. And the important feature, you're talking about, what is a shrubbery? A shrubbery is basically a group of shrubs, obviously, flowers, trees, and with a path. The important thing is that you have a path, preferably gravel, something to keep your feet dry. So think of Mr. Woodhouse worrying about Jane Fairfax. My dear, did you get your stocking? Did you change your stockings? People thought the madness of King George developed when he didn't change his stockings after they got wet.
That's awesome.
So almost every garden near the house, if they had a shrubbery, that would have gravel paths, and that would be safe. So like Marianne Dashwood, if you look in the book, she's wandering around in the grass, wild grass. She gets her feet wet.
And that's why
That
she
is what
almost
kills her.
dies.
That's why she almost dies, is she did not have a shrubbery, or she didn't stay in the shrubbery. Exactly.
Yeah, so that's where the gentlewomen and the old hypochondriac men are walking. Okay, so that actually that casts new light on Elizabeth Bennet just walking across the muddy countryside 3 miles. That's not what a gentlewoman would do. She has to stick to the gravel pathways.
Yeah, and the country women would. I mean, Austen obviously would have done things like that. You'd take off cross country. Fancy city ladies like the Bingleys wouldn't. But in between there, it's like, well, how dirty is it, as they say? How muddy. And she went right across the mud right after rain, and that just shows she's young and vigorous. But you even see Austen talks. She wrote to one of her nieces, Anna, critiquing a novel, and she talked about the girl was walking outside in the damp, and Jane Austen said, "Nope, you better take that out. I'm anxious mother wouldn't suffer that to happen." So this was common wisdom.
That's interesting.
Still, I picture Austen walking cross country a fair amount. So there's another view. So this is the kitchen garden. Again, growing in old methods. I love this one. There's seashells, supposedly as the scarecrow. They clack together, and I can't imagine it works, judging by my garden. So I'm just showing pictures of the pretty things. I show this because to me, this is a woodcut of a gentlewoman out working in the garden. And Austen makes a point of all the ladies in her books that are interested in gardens, and some surprising people like Elizabeth Elliot in Persuasion. But I imagine her idea of gardening is mostly directing the gardener. So we can
sort of like Lady Bertram too. Like, she wants the roses cut. She's not going to do it herself. Like, Fanny's going to do it, obviously.
No,
but.
Yeah. I've heard it said that if you go through a great big fancy garden now with a gardener, and if you don't see dirt under their fingernails, or if they don't reach down and pick up a weed, you know that they actually didn't do it. So, but Mrs. Austen did her own gardening. She dug her own weeds. She dug potatoes. That was quite a thing for her. So, like Mr. Collins, we know the Austens kept bees in their garden to make mead. And then Austen, this is where I do see Jane Austen's involvement. She talks about what flowers are blooming, what they're planning to plant. So this is one of my favorite quotes, where she talks about the young peony. This is at Chawton Cottage, is just coming into bloom, and that the shrubbery is going to be gay with pinks and sweet williams and columbines. And then I have to point out that syringa, if you ever read this, gardeners will say syringa is a lilac, but in those days it actually was mock orange. So when Austen speaks of
that means,
yeah, well, I have a picture. So
okay.
Well, I'll show you. I have a poem that she was inspired by, but Austen actually speaks of lilacs, and when she means lilacs, she says lilacs. So
okay,
yeah. So.
Yeah, no, I have a brown thumb. I love looking at these pictures, but I am not good at keeping these things alive. And so I love having experts on here like you who can tell me what even kinds of flowers are, because I don't even know their names.
I have to say, though, this is because I wouldn't say I have a brown thumb, but I like to describe myself as a garden enthusiast, as opposed to an expert, because that covers a multitude of sins that, like, well, I'm trying. And I come to it from the history point of view.
I'm an armchair gardener.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and I'm always messing around with things. So, like, this is a picture of a quote about the Austens trying to grow. She's writing to Cassandra, who is, I think, the main person interested in their gardens. But they're trying to grow mignonette seed, and they've got mignonette seed from Godmersham, Edward's estate, and because they would pass plants and seeds and things around to each other, and nobody could get it to grow. And so I have done with a couple of years with my friends, I pass out mignonette seed and we all try to get it to grow. It's kind of indifferent success, but it's a very common, fragrant, very unassuming little flower, but very scented, especially useful around outhouses. And then this is a view from the inside of Chawton Cottage, but I love that because it reminds me, of the view that Austen had outdoors, and the gardener always puts flowers in there from outside. I had some city gardens, if you like.
I wouldn't have imagined that there would be any at the time, but I guess they would still need access to vegetables and things like that. So tell me about city gardens.
Yeah, they would not have grown them in the town, especially London. They had to the west, Kensington, that area. there's a whole market garden area, very beautiful and lush, and a little bit more away from the London soot. So this woodcut I'm showing is actually of a garden engine, they called it. It's a barrel of water with a pump. And so he is, instead of, we just turn a faucet and water comes out, but you had to pump and you would hose things off. And in cities, the air was so bad, they would advise syringing your flowers off. They mean hosing them off to keep the soot. And so actually it was so bad that rich people would just contract and have their plants replaced. A gardener would come in. So yes, you weren't growing your food in the city proper, but there were some nice little places. So the Austens, when Jane Austen was 25, they moved to Bath. And so we've seen these beautiful pictures of the countryside. And then I think, well, how did she make do in Bath? And you get some clues that she didn't really care for it. If you judge, I mean, Catherine Morland seems to like Bath, but Anne Elliot,
by the time you get to Persuasion, she's tired of it. You can tell.
Exactly. If you're forced to go live there, you know, if you're going to go shop and go to some balls and meet some nice young men, that's one thing. But if you go from this beautiful countryside to this stony, sooty city, you know, I think that
it's stifling.
That must have been a come down.
Yeah.
So, but Jane Austen wrote very enthusiastically about the fact that they would be nice to live near Sydney Gardens. So this is where they ended up for the most part. Those of you who've been to Bath, number 4 Sydney Place. And then this is the garden in the back. This is a typical city garden. Gravel, gravel, keep your feet dry, right? So you got to have that. And that's it. A few leaves. Here's behind their house at 25 Gay Street. That they lived for about 6 months, and there again, those walls that you see are the extent, and then back to the alley there. That's it. But Sydney Gardens is where Austen did most of her walking, and then the countryside around Bath. So what's fun is if you go there, a lot of the features are the same. That bridge is actually dated 1800. I mean, to me, it looks Art Deco or something, doesn't it? But it's actually from Austen's era. So this is mock orange.
And so why is it called mock orange? Does it smell like orange blossoms?
It's very fragrant. I think it looks similar and has the sweet smell to like you think of orange blossom, which they cooked with a lot. This is the gravel walk leading up to another Georgian garden. And I just show this because this is the gravel walk where Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth walked. So I would like to point out that most of the important romantic scenes in the novels take place out of doors.
That is important. That's interesting. I would like to
start looking at
further
it
now that I'm thinking about it. And they do that and sometimes, you know, the movie scenes can get blurred with the books and you're like, did that only happen in the movie or does that happen in the books as well? But I think you're right. Definitely Darcy and Elizabeth, they're walking outdoors at the very end when he does his second declaration. Emma,
his first declaration was indoors, and he was failed. Wrong. His second worked. The other person who proposes indoors is Mr. Collins.
Oh, of course.
I mean, practically within earshot of Mrs. Bennet. Yeah. So Mr. Knightley proposes outdoors.
Yeah, outdoors.
Henry Tilney. When he and Catherine walked next door to the neighbors.
Yes. Kim, you're blown this wide open. I don't think I've ever noticed that before. Yeah. That is wonderful. And I mean, of course, it works really well for the movies because it's so gorgeous. Like in multiple versions of Emma, they're near a huge tree outdoors or like a weeping willow or something. And it's very romantic. And I'm going to have to re-examine everything now.
And I have to tell you, the other thing to notice is that a lot of the interior emotional scenes of the heroines, or heroes for that matter, take place out of doors. So I've noticed that my joking notice is that every time one of her heroines gets upset, she flings herself into the shrubbery. And so, you know, like Emma, after she starts to think about Mr. Knightley, she goes outside. Jane and Elizabeth go outside to get away from Mrs. Bennet. And so in Pride and Prejudice, I picture maybe Jane and Cassandra did the same thing. But every time someone's upset, they need to go outside to think, to be alone, to reflect. And Jane Austen uses the word to indulge their feelings. You see that word indulge over and over. And I think it is an indulgence if you're surrounded by family, servants, constant things happening. You go outside. Go into the garden.
I love that insight. That's so great. That brings me to, I wanted to ask this question, which is like, in your book, you've pointed out that loving nature is a sort of litmus test of moral character in Austen's books. The good characters appreciate nature, the bad ones don't. Can we get into some of those examples? Because I think that's really fun.
Sure.
So one of the examples that I
yes.
immediately thought of was Fanny from Sense and Sensibility, Fanny Ferris. Ferrers. No.
Yes.
Dashwood, because she gets married. So she used to be Ferrers, and then she's Dashwood. So John Dashwood's wife. She's gonna do a greenhouse at Norland Park, and they're gonna knock down all these old walnut trees. And you could just it says Eleanor kept her concern and her censure to herself, and was very thankful that Marianne was not present to share the provocation, because Marianne couldn't have remained silent if she heard that all the walnut trees are going to be knocked down at Norland Park. And that's how Fanny's a bad person, because she's going to knock down these old walnut trees.
You're right, exactly. I think that Austen is inviting us to judge the character of her characters by their reaction to nature and scenic beauty. So the characters we love nature, and the characters that we love to hate don't. My favorite examples, there's one that really resonates with me, is General Tilney, who seems to be preoccupied with his gardens, because he's bragging about them. He's going on about his pinery and all, and they make pineapples, by the way. Everything, though, is a boast. And the one scene that I noticed was where Catherine is visiting Henry Tilney's house and sees a beautiful little cottage, and he was going to have it knocked down. The general was, but she appreciates it. It's so sweet and it's so pretty among the trees and apple trees. And he decides that, because he thinks she's an heiress, great, we'll preserve it. But this was common at the time. They would have to try to convince the landowners to keep these features, or to do something good for their cottagers as a picturesque object, rather than because it was the moral thing to do.
The right thing to do. Well, yeah. One of the famous quotes about Pemberley is when Elizabeth is seeing it, and she says she had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. And so that Mr. Darcy is the kind of man who doesn't give in to those whims of fads and taste. He's not going to just knock stuff down at Pemberley because it's the fashionable thing to do. He's going to sort of preserve its august nature and what natural beauty has done for it.
And we see clues that his estate was improved, as they said at the time, but someone with some sense and taste, and perhaps Mr. Darcy himself or his father, controlled it. So you see little references like that there's rustic streams, and then you have the appropriate rustic bridge over the stream. And so everything is just as it should be. And I contrast that with how, it's a good thing Mr. Rushworth is getting Humphrey Repton to help him in when he redoes Southerton, because otherwise he'd blow it, right? He would have some monstrosity. So yes, and I think probably the biggest example, Fanny Dashwood, you're right, but Mary Crawford. I don't know how she struck you the first time you read Mansfield Park, but at first I thought she was delightful, and I thought she was going to be another Elizabeth Bennet, because she's sprightly and modern, and you don't see those moral flaws at first. But when you reread it now and just look for those garden and nature markers, there's red flags all over the place. I mean, she's careless. She just doesn't care about nature. And contrast
she's
that
a
with
city
Fanny
girl,
Price.
for sure.
Yeah, and it's a rot deep in her soul. But Fanny, of course, is very attuned, very sensitive.
Yeah.
So yes.
The other moral litmus test that I really like in Austen, and this is true across most of literature, is that people who like books are good people, and people who don't like books are bad people. So I can't remember. I don't think that it's in the book, but in the 1996 version of Sense and Sensibility, Fanny Dashwood goes into the library and she takes a big sniff and she's like, "Oh, it smells like old books in here." And you're like, if you don't like that smell, you're a bad person. And that's how the audience knows that Fanny, she's gonna knock down old trees, and she doesn't like old books. Like, she's a witch. She's a bad person.
Exactly. Miss Bingley, John Thorpe, has no interest in anything proper.
They don't like novels, but Henry Tilney. Dear
Henry Tilney and Eleanor Tilney, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So I included, if you are in Bath and you wanted to get an idea, this is the Georgian Garden in Bath, and they have this wonderful recreation of an earlier 18th century city garden. But the cool thing is that those are original features. It had been covered by fill when they excavated the kitchen, and somebody at the archaeology service said, "Hey, let's look underneath there before we dig it up," and this was all there. Even that pole they know, which is a honeysuckle pole, they could see the post hole, like in archaeology, you see that. So just an idea. And a beautiful, beautiful ornate garden bench, which I'm trying to talk my husband into seeing if we can build one of those. But so Austen would have known those kinds of gardens in Bath, London as well, when she visited her brother Henry, who lived in London. So this is one of his houses. And sadly, his garden, which she called quite a love, and how much she enjoyed going into it, that was swept away. They put a road through it. But the center square, those garden squares in the middle of London, is still the same. And it's private and locked, just like it would have been in those days. So this is something I managed to take through the bushes.
That's funny.
And then
let's talk about the manor houses.
Okay, so yes, to me, I mean, she knew quite a few manor houses. Her brother had two great estates, Gomersham but everyone wonders what's Pemberley based on. And some people say Chatsworth. And indeed, if you look at Austen's description, she says that Pemberley is 10 miles around. Well, Chatsworth, I believe, was 9, and Blenheim was like 12 miles around. So Pemberley is right up there. So every time I look at pictures from that, to me, I'm just going to go, this is Pemberley. So there. Yeah.
Well, and Chatsworth is the one in the 1995 movie, right?
Well, the one with Colin Firth, I think they used Lime Hall, but the Keira Knightley version, they used Chatsworth.
Oh, okay. All right. So I got them confused. Chatsworth is from the 2005 version.
Right. Okay. Right. But I always look at like Blenheim Palace here, like there's a garden. So when I think of, the description of the Austens and the gardeners, I mean, not the Austens, Elizabeth Bennet and the gardeners wandering the grounds. Here's a similar map from 1789. And I think, okay, so let's just erase that and say Pemberley. The kind of view that you see there. And so this is where you think from every window there are beauties to be seen. I mean, no wonder she gets there and just thinking just a little bit, possibly regretfully,
Oh yeah.
Of this, all this I might have
Pemberley would be something.
And then in her real life, we know she visited Addlestone Park, for example, this one, and Stoneleigh Abbey, where I did a lot of touring. And Mrs. Austen, Jane's mother, was a Lee. So this is Stoneleigh Abbey.
Oh,
and
okay.
Her cousins owned this. And so this is an example of where the gardens there, they are using, and here it is in 1795, so as it would have looked when Austen was there. And this is Humphrey Repton's before and after. So this is the way it was, and this is how he said it could have been.
Okay,
so this is
that's improved.
Yeah, it's the improvement of the estate. And they didn't take up all his ideas, but I will show you 3 years after the Austens were there. They did move the river. That's and because it's more picturesque, and you can see the sheep out there being picturesque in the distance. That's a whole other talking about picturesque and clumps of 3 sheep, if you can get it. No, really, when people visited the gardens, they would suggest you send your workers out, and if possible, get the animals to stand in clumps, groups of 3.
That is so funny. I remember, I think, again, back to the 1996 Sense and Sensibility, I think it was Ang Lee, the director, or somebody who worked on that film was like, I am never working with sheep again. They're so obnoxious, because they were always trying to get them, like, serenely chewing grass in the background, and they would just mess up the shot every time. And so I think it's actually really annoying to try and herd sheep where you want them to go.
Well, there's hysterical, that I just love reading the garden books at the time, because mostly they're just funny to me. These people had too much money and time on their hands. But they would say, send out your workers, preferably dressed in, as European peasants or something, and then, or in white. And if they were in white, you would have them stand where you wanted your eye to be drawn, and away from some perhaps quite a little bit more unsightly area. And then so again,
they really they're just like props or scenery. Like that's so Marie Antoinette. Like no wonder they chopped her head off, right?
I think that the English were lucky that the average Brit was a little more phlegmatic, you know,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And they
Well,
weren't
that.
as poor. So,
Oh yeah. Well, and
oh,
that
well,
leads me to a question I wanted to ask because like the servant class is often pretty invisible in Austen's novels, but can you tell us a bit more about the responsibilities of a Regency era gardener? Apparently being
sure.
white scenery in the background is one of their responsibilities, but like maintaining the grounds at an estate like Pemberley seems like a really
Oh,
enormous
exactly.
undertaking.
Let me flip really quickly to get to my slides that I have of that.
Sure.
So just these are this is her brother's estate, and again, you note the clump of three of animals there. Um,
Mhm.
just this is again, I like to think this is what Austen saw and was inspired by.
Mhm.
So getting to, and here's the fallen avenues. The limes are lindens, by the way, for Americans wondering about lime avenues. So and Chawton House, her brother also owned. Do a whole thing on ha-has. The wilderness.
Yep.
I'm just flipping, for
Love
those
it.
of you on audio, I'm just flipping through pictures of her brother's estates, Godmersham, the herb garden, which the Wisconsin region sponsors. So I have to get that in. Okay, so yes, gardeners. I think what people don't realize, well, actually, maybe you do, but how many servants were needed to run a household, one of the great households of the time? Because it's like if you go to some grand estate now where you can, where it's a hotel, it's the same
Mhm.
thing. You need innumerable indoor servants, um, outdoor servants. Someone like the Austens at their own house, they had a cook, an indoor maid, and an outdoor man who sometimes would also wait at table. He would be
Mhm.
doing the gardening. In the cities, they would have what they call a job gardener, someone you hire, just like you might have a lawn care service or a garden service come in now.
Like contracted
But
out.
so someone like this fellow, I'm showing a woodcut of some industrious gardener. But what I notice is in all of the beautiful pictures of gardens of the time, in the background, invisible, as you say, there's always gardeners. They are
Mhm.
just part of the scenery. I'm sure that uh, Elizabeth Elliot feels that she did that entire garden and really she just directed it, right? So
Uh-huh.
here's this lovely couple walking, and then there's the gardener on the side.
I can't even. Oh, there
Um,
he is. He was blending into the
yeah,
background.
yeah. I love this. Here's the gardener. There's a comical scene. I think that's Dr. Syntax falling in a
Yes, he's got the
greenhouse.
chin.
Mm-hmm. Um, so even in the comic caricatures, so there you see the gardener in the background. So
Mhm.
everywhere there is something elegant happening, it's because there's workers in the background. At a place like Pemberley, Chatsworth had, I think, 100 outdoor workers, a lot of whom were involved in the farming and the woodlands, but they had 30 workers just for the pleasure grounds alone.
Wow.
So uh, that would that would probably keep your garden up. I'd be grateful just to get like a part-time worker.
Mhm.
Women and children often were hired from the village to do the weeding during the season. This scene I'm showing is the mulberry picking. So this is what you were talking about. Cassandra tried to grow mulberry trees at Chawton Cottage. Um, General Tilney talks about, or Catherine Morland sees that General Tilly appears to have an entire parish at work in his gardens, his acres and acres of kitchen garden. So he's
Mhm.
not only supplying the food for his family, for the household, but he's selling them as well. So
Mhm.
those 100 pines that he produces, 100 pineapples, he's selling those for
I
like
don't
a
think
guinea a
I.
piece.
I don't think I knew until right now that they were talking about pineapples in Northanger
Yeah.
Abbey. I think I assumed pine trees. I don't think I ever thought about it. You're illuminating so many things for me today, Kim. That's great.
Well, I know where I'm glossing over things but yeah, this is the fun part, isn't it, with Austen, is no matter how deep you get in, there's some new thing. It's,
Mhm.
I find myself, lately I've been listening to audiobooks of them,
Mhm.
and there's always something new. I'm laughing out loud in my car as I drive along. People probably wonder what's wrong with me. But then there's something like, yeah, pinery. No, it's a hothouse, not just a greenhouse, but a hothouse with successive peat beds for growing pineapples, because England, right? The climate.
Mhm.
And when you got done, you would have a fruit that you could sell in the market for possibly about $100,
I
depending on the
yeah.
time.
I knew they were
So,
hugely popular and a status symbol. And like we had Janine Barkis on a little while ago, and she's in the midst of a project where she's researching all the things that you could rent during Regency times, because like
mhm,
you can't afford a pineapple like to buy it, but you can rent it, so it's just on, nobody's gonna eat it, it's just gonna be on the
mhm,
table so everyone can see like, ooh, they have a
yeah.
pineapple. Like
So,
I
and
think
you
that's
look at,
hilarious.
yeah, I read it. There was one novel I read from the time where these nouveau riche people embarrassed. I mean, people were horrified because this family had rented the pineapple, and these other people sliced into it and ate it. You
Oh
know,
no.
so but the rich really were eating them, and you see all sorts of wonderful recipes, ice cream and whatnot. But yes, that symbol of hospitality actually, they're bragging that they're rich.
Status. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now in America, it was less so. It was much more affordable here. I mean, we grew them
Because we're
here.
closer. Yeah.
And they did import some, but for the most part, you had to grow them in England. So it took, fuel to heat the hot houses, people to provide the labor, chop the wood, stoke the fires. There's a succession of steps you went through, and a lot of insect problems, and so at Austen's day, it still was very, very expensive. Like I said, maybe a guinea a piece. You sometimes see them sold for, so 100-ish.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Um, and what was I going to say? Oh, so that's what General Tilney's boasting about. He
Mm-hmm.
had 100 of them. So
Yeah. No, and then now I need to go back and read that scene and like replace the pine trees in my mind with pineapples. So that'll be a completely different interpretation. That's
yeah.
awesome. I think we only have time for like one more question. Can you explain follies and hermits to me? Like, would rich people actually hire hairy strangers to live on their property, and why?
Yes, I know, because you're thinking of the scene in Pride and Prejudice where Lady Catherine notices that they have a prettish kind of a little wilderness, and Mrs. Bennet says, "Yes, take and show her ladyship to the hermitage." Right?
Yeah. What
So,
is that?
you would have decorative structures in your garden, and if you had to have one structure, you would have a hermitage. Um, and yes, there were people who actually would hire, you see advertisements of the time, actually hire a person or try to hire a person to sit in there and I guess surprise the visitors. There were these were parts of follies. So for example, like this one here, this is a Gothic seat at Stoneleigh Abbey, a rustic seat.
Mhm.
Um, here's a grotto at Houghton Lodge, although that was never usable. It's just full of bats. But this is an example of a hermitage,
Ooh,
a sort of a rustic little hut.
it
And
looks fairy tale-ish.
it is. They tried everything. They tried to make it sort of to the imagination. So you'd have Grecian temples next to a fake ruin next to a little hut like this. And you were supposed to think that this was the site of some religious ascetic who was in there contemplating mortality.
Mhm.
And even if they didn't hire someone, you would often go in there, be stacks of books on, mortality, and maybe a
Uh-huh.
skull or something that, you'd be contemplate. So it's all just meant to evoke poetry and thought and deep, soulful reflections. I don't think Mrs. Bennet actually hired one because people had the worst time keeping hermits. They would advertise, they'd say, we'll give you like several £100 if you can stick this out for 7 years and not cut your hair, not cut your nails, not bathe,
Oh, geez.
interact with the
Like, what
visitors as
kind of
they walked along.
person responds to that want ad, right? Like, you're gonna
Oh,
get
yeah.
some weirdos. Like,
Well, like this one at Paynes Hill, I'm showing a picture of Paynes Hill Hermitage. Um, this is the kind of fellow they wanted. This
oh,
was a real
geez.
hermit.
Can
Yeah.
you describe that for our listeners?
He is wearing something cobbled together with patched, just like little bitty patched bits of hide and I don't know, I imagine mouse hide, but probably bits of fabric. And this man was a real hermit. This is the Hermit of Dinton, John Bigg. But this is what everyone had in their brain when they were thinking, could they hire someone to pretend to be this? I mean, they got
Uh-huh.
to be such a silly thing. They made a play out of it, where a guy says he's going to be a hermit to hide from the debt collectors, or he's going to take one of those ads. But the one at Paynes Hill here, they hired a guy, he agreed to do it, and 3 weeks later they had to fire him because they kept finding him at the pub drinking. And so,
That's awesome.
so yes, definitely too much time and money on their hands.
Mm-hmm. What a funny, strange little bit of history. I love that. There's so much that we didn't get around to, Kim. This was so fun, though. Thank you for coming on the show
I
today.
I think that really it's all covered in the novels themselves, right? So we're
Well, where can listeners go to learn more about your work? You said that your garden book is out of print, so I cannot get
I
it.
think so. Yeah. Yeah. My website is kimwilsonauthor.com.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you for this wonderful conversation. I had a lot of fun.
I did too. Thank you so much for having me.